Madrid, autumn, 1834. The air in the El Escorial Palace was as thick as the damp dust on its ancient stone walls. Winds from the Sierra mountain range swept through the cold stone corridors, rustling the heavy red velvet curtains like secrets. Whispered for 2 decades, in the East Room where light never touched the stone floor, a man stood motionless before the body of King Ferdinand VII. Not a general, not a bishop, it was the royal physician. He wasn't there to heal, nor to pray, he was there to preserve, but not the entire body. Just one specific part, a part that had haunted the entire Spanish court, shattered marriages, thrown politics into disarray, and was even believed to have plunged the once world-dominating empire into an irreversible crisis. The king's penis, covered in black silk. King Ferdinand's body lay still on the marble slab. His skin was wrinkled, his face ashen like a wax figure. But that wasn't what terrified the physician. True to the secret records of the court's doctors, what lay beneath the cloth could not be called a common medical term. It wasn't a penis, nor even genitalia anymore. It was a living symbol of biological anomaly, a true physiological monster, measuring nearly 14 inches, approximately 35.5 centimeters long. It had an unusual shape, with a base as slender as a chopstick, but abruptly widening in the middle. Twisted like a branch, with excess tissue protruding like tumors. The color was uneven, from pale gray at the tip to bruised purple in the middle, and small scars as if it had been cut, stitched, and recut. Without direct light, the physician knew this was the object that had dominated the entire palace, and the entire monarchy. In fact, Ferdinand was no stranger to the medical community. Throughout his life, he had been treated by dozens of doctors, physicians, alchemists, shamans, astrologers, all pursued an impossible mission to free the king from his royal burden, as he mockingly and bitterly described his own anatomy. But the truth was not funny. It was dangerous. It was cruel. It turned Ferdinand from a frail prince into a paranoid dictator, torturing 3 wives to death, plunging Spain into civil war, and ultimately leaving a legacy more horrific than any war: an embalmed corpse, with its genitalia preserved separately in a silver box, sealed with the church's emblem, and stored in the Vatican's secret archives. The physician stood silently for a long moment. In his hand was a first-generation formaldehyde solution, a mixture of acid, salts, and herbs, enough to prevent tissue decomposition for years. He had previously preserved Queen Maria Josepha's heart, Crown Prince Carlos's stomach, and even the hands of a traitorous general. But this was the first time he had been ordered to preserve a biological symbol of royal decay. He recalled the hushed conversations in the palace infirmary about the screams on the wedding nights of the queens, about the custom-made pillows placed in the king's bed, about the French doctors invited to measure, draw, and even attempt to create fertility aids for the king. One once said, "Ferdinand doesn't need a doctor. He needs a mechanic, an alchemist, and a priest for confession, all at once." Each drop of the preserving solution fell like a curse. In that moment, the physician suddenly realized he wasn't just preserving a body part, he was embalming a monarchy. A dynasty where every malfunction, from body to soul, from sex to politics, originated from a single deformity. In the palace corridor, Queen Regent Maria Cristina was weeping, not because her husband had just died, but because she knew from this day forward, she and her young daughter, Isabella, would have to inherit the full consequences of a cursed reign. An empire that once ruled half the world now remained only in memory, in bloodlines, and in a sealed silver box. Ferdinand VII, once dubbed El Decido, the Desired One, turned out to be Spain's greatest curse. And the greatest tragedy was, he was never purely evil. He was the product of a chain of genetic errors, the abuse of power, and an unresolvable obsession with his own body. A king drowned by what should have been the symbol of male power. His physical self. The physician finished his work, placing the specimen tube into the sealed casket. On it, he carved an ancient Latin inscription, Corpus Regis, deformitis hoc regnum, destruxit. The king's deformed body, this is what destroyed the kingdom. If one truly wants to find the cause that turned Ferdinand VII into a king deformed in both body and soul, one cannot start with him alone. One must go further. Across time, through the dusty basements of medieval castles, turning the golden mask-like pages of genealogies, and untangling the labyrinthine marriage ties between European royal families. In that maze, one name stands out, not for glory, but for the deadly legacy it sowed for centuries. Habsburg. The Habsburg dynasty, with its ambition to control all of Christian Europe, built an empire stretching from Spain to Austria, from the Netherlands to Milan, using a simple yet dangerous strategy: inbreeding. They didn't fight, they married. They didn't conquer with swords, they used matrimony. For over 200 years, the Habsburgs engaged in more than 30 incestuous marriages, including uncle marrying niece, cousin marrying cousin, and even father marrying his grandniece, to preserve pure royal blood. What they preserved was not glory, but a faulty genetic code, passed down from generation to generation. Skull deformities, the famous Habsburg jaw, neurological disorders, early onset dementia, infertility, and especially abnormal variations in male hormone development. Ferdinand VII, born in the 10th generation since Charles V, the founder of the great Habsburg Spanish Empire, was one of the individuals who bore the heaviest genetic burden ever recorded in history. Ferdinand's closest ancestor, King Charles II of Spain, was a public biological disaster. He couldn't speak until age 4, couldn't walk until age 8, and had such a protruding jaw that he couldn't close his mouth. Believed to be completely impotent and infertile, Charles II died childless, ending the Spanish Habsburg branch, but the gene line didn't die. It continued to be nurtured in marriage alliances with the Bourbons, and it was from there that Ferdinand emerged. Ferdinand was the son of Charles IV and Maria Louisa of Parma, who were first cousins. This meant that the child born to them, Ferdinand, had a 15 times higher probability of carrying disease, causing homozygous genes, than a normal person. And fate was unforgiving. From childhood, Ferdinand showed abnormal signs: a narrow rib cage, unusually long hands, chronic digestive disorders, and genitalia that defied all natural proportions. Not only excessively long, but also with asymmetrical development and unidentified redundant tissues. When he was 12, the royal physician noted in a secret memo to the Vatican, "The prince's body is like a cross between a god and a demon. He has the gentle eyes of a saint, but below the waist is the structure of something not belonging to humanity." A more scientific description is found in the medical records of Salamanca Military Hospital, describing Ferdinand as suffering from macropenies with extreme penile curvature, a combination of genital tract malformation syndrome, hypertrophic soft tissue disorder, and penile cartilage dysplasia. Some modern endocrinologists even suspect he may have suffered from paradoxical hypergonadotropic hypergonadism, meaning excessive male hormones that resulted in a functionally useless biological structure. The result was that Ferdinand possessed an organ considered hypermasculine in size, yet it was a deadly trap in terms of function and psychology. In the ancient world, where a small penis was a symbol of refinement, as Greek statues often depicted small penises to convey wisdom, control, and reason, a boy with an unusually large organ was seen as a biological anomaly, closer to a monster than a human. Court records also show that Ferdinand's parents did not care for their son as a person, but as a political problem. When they learned of his deformity, they did not seek treatment, but rather concealment. The palace was ordered to isolate the prince from diplomatic eyes. Maids were forbidden to mention details related to his improper form. Those who addressed the prince were transferred to distant fortresses. Ferdinand grew up not with love but with the feeling that he was a shameful national secret, and like all secrets, suppressed in darkness, it began to transform into hatred. Teenage Ferdinand began exhibiting alarming behaviors. He secretly cut his own genitals with a razor blade, recorded in the memoirs of a chaplain, as to make it smaller, to fit the standard of normal men. A physician confessed, the prince hated his body so much, he wanted to destroy it piece by piece. From self-hatred, he learned to hate others. From victim, he became tormentor. Ferdinand gradually developed a personality disorder, what modern psychiatry might call a combination of paranoid disorder, body dysmorphic disorder, and antisocial personality, especially when he wielded power. Early signs of controlling and punitive behavior emerged at age 17, when a guard accidentally caught him in his changing room. Ferdinand didn't just get angry, he ordered the man tortured and his entire family banished from Madrid. From then on, discretion became his rule of life. But beneath that surface was an unquenchable obsession. How could an abnormal body fulfill the most sacred duty of a king, producing an heir? For monarchies, biological impotence was not a personal issue. It was a matter of national security. And Ferdinand, born from a faulty genetic legacy, became the most vivid symbol of that truth. It was in this despair that Ferdinand would enter his first marriage, not with love, but with the desperate hope that he could fix himself through another's body. But what awaited him and the Queen's was not salvation. It was hell. In European royal courts, deformity was often hidden behind velvet curtains or dazzling titles. But, in late 18th century Madrid, deformity wasn't just a secret. It was the throbbing core of an entire power system. Deep within the cold stone corridors and royal ceremonial rituals was a young prince tormented daily by his own body. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the deformity itself. It was how he learned to weaponize his pain, turn his complexes into an ideology, and himself into an instrument of absolute control, a physical dictator. Ferdinand, 17, was no longer the weak victim described in the memoirs of chaplains as the quiet boy, always hugging a pillow by the window. No, at this age, he had begun to exploit his position in court as a buffer zone between power and danger. In the eyes of the nobility, Ferdinand was the king's eldest son, a symbol of succession. But deep down, he understood better than anyone that the crown could slip from his head at any moment if the truth about his physical form and fertility were exposed. From then on, Ferdinand learned to strike first with an unmoving, yet constantly scrutinizing gaze. Ferdinand observed everyone around him. He learned to memorize whispers, analyze every glance, and became obsessed with what people were thinking about him. For a teenager with body dysmorphia, every smiling look could be mockery. Every polite gesture could hint at what was beneath the clothes. And from the first time he was ridiculed by a servant who was subsequently beaten and exiled from Madrid. Ferdinand understood that his existence was tied to making others fear him. That fear didn't come from the power of the scepter, but from the uncertainty he created. A court advisor wrote in his diary, "We never knew whether His Majesty would laugh or order an execution." Every glance from the prince was like flipping a coin. The lucky ones lived. The ones who guessed wrong disappeared. This psychology, toying with power as a way to control the gaze of others, began to shape his later governance. Ferdinand was not yet crowned, but he was already practicing kingship by manipulating the lives of others, like pawns. No one was allowed to look at him without feeling a chill down their spine. No one was allowed to hear about his body without feeling danger. He didn't need fame. He needed dread. At 20, Ferdinand began to punish himself with strange methods. He hired Italian alchemists to create mixtures from pearl shells, rhino horns, whalebone ash to apply to his deformed area, hoping to normalize it. When that failed, he turned to yoga practices learned from Eastern monks, even using custom-made iron belts to tightly compress his penis for hours every night, like a self-flagellating devotee. A doctor who secretly reported to the Neapolitan court wrote, he believed that if he suffered enough, God would revoke the curse sewn into his body. However, the strange thing was, the more he suffered, the more violent Ferdinand became. Biological pain did not turn him into a saint, but created a twisted form of morality. If I hurt, the world must also hurt. From then on, he began to manipulate others psychologically with his own imperfections. Most notably, his relationships with his tutors and private chaplains. On several occasions, he deliberately exposed his grotesque body parts while changing in front of them, as a silent challenge. If they were embarrassed, he mocked them. If they asked questions, he ordered them transferred. An old clergyman was banished from court for accidentally saying God created everyone in their own image, a seemingly comforting remark that Ferdinand took as sarcasm. From then on, tutors taught him in silence, and he learned to control others' speech to protect what he could not fix within himself. In 1802, at exactly 18 years old, Ferdinand underwent a premarital medical examination, an almost mandatory ritual among royalty. The results were not disclosed, but palace doctors began preparing items for maximum assistance on the wedding night. These included saddle-shaped pillows, soft leather straps to secure the wife's waist, cushioned wooden frames, and herbal oil solutions to mildly numb. This event marked a major turning point. Ferdinand's problem was no longer a biological secret, but a court policy. The wedding was no longer a religious ceremony, but a royal theatrical performance to cover up a reproduction campaign aided by the technology of the time. The best blacksmiths in Madrid were summoned under the pretense of crafting royal beds. Doctors were ordered to absolutely not handwrite any reports. The bride's ladies-in-waiting were trained on how to handle the Queen's unexpected reactions. Throughout this process, Ferdinand showed no emotion, no fear, no shame, just coldness. Some said he had shifted from self-consciousness to identifying himself with his abnormality, that he no longer saw himself as a deformed man, but as a being created to challenge the world with a structure no one could understand. A French missionary, after meeting Ferdinand, wrote, "He is no longer a man. He is the living dogma of a delusional God." And so, Ferdinand's wedding night was not merely a tragedy between two individuals. It was the birth of a new institution. Where sex was a duty, women were reproductive tools. Pain was a political condition, and the king was the center of a state organized around biological deviance. From that night, Ferdinand entered his succession, and like one who wore the crown, not by conquest, but by the right to deny his own shame through state power, he began to rule Spain as an extension of his own body. If he couldn't cure the deformity within, he would turn the entire nation into a tool to conceal and serve it. When Ferdinand ascended the throne, Spain didn't just gain a new king. They gained an institutionalized pathology. October 1802, the royal palace in Madrid glowed as if history were about to open a new chapter. Flags fluttered throughout the grand streets. Concerts echoed from the Almudena Cathedral to the central square. People gathered under the ancient fig trees, discussing the bride from the south, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples, who would become the wife of Prince Ferdinand, dubbed El Decido, the awaited one. But if they knew what awaited her on that first night, surely the wedding would never have had fireworks. Maria Antonia was only 15 then, slender, with bright eyes and a small mouth always slightly open, as if still learning how to speak in front of strangers. Her education, like most European princesses of that era, was a series of lessons on how to fold napkins, distinguish bowing order, and recite prayers in Latin. As for sex, all she knew was a man and a woman will do something on the wedding night to produce an heir. No one explained specifics. No one prepared her beyond vague blessings. Everything will be fine. But no one mentioned that her husband was a man whose body made doctors' hands tremble during examinations. No one mentioned that the wedding bed had been modified by carpenters, with a specific supporting structure to avoid severe injury to the partner. No one spoke of the collection of pillows, straps, and ointments arranged like surgical instruments in an infirmary. Everyone smiled. Everyone kept silent. That silence was an unspoken promise. A woman's fear would be an offering to preserve the dynasty's honor. The wedding night followed an 8-hour royal ceremony. The bride was led to her room to cries of "Viva los Reyes," the last optimistic sounds Maria would hear in her emotional life. Walls were draped with purple velvet curtains. Scented candles lit along the corridors. In the room, maids had prepared custom-made pillows with a central groove, soft white cloths, and jars of ointment containing opium extract and beeswax used as an anesthetic and tissue balm. These items were carefully placed on a silver tray as if they were offerings. Maria didn't understand what they were. but from the uneasy glances of the servants, she began to sense something was wrong. And then the door opened. Ferdinand entered. Not with roses, not with blessings, but with the empty gaze of a man entering a necessary surgical procedure. His long robe was removed, not to invite intimacy, but to reveal a secret that had been buried for too long. The moment Maria saw her husband's body, she screamed. Not a scream of surprise, but a scream of primal horror, like a child witnessing a monster emerging from a closet. A maid later wrote, "She recoiled, hitting the wall, pointing at him, and shrieking, 'Monster, monster.'" She was no longer speaking Spanish, but another language, the language of panic. The consummation that night did not unfold like any wedding night in history. It was a forced medical procedure, taking place in the presence of his private physician, a maid specializing in preparing medication, and 3 old women from Naples brought over long ago to teach Maria how to endure. Under flickering candlelight, Ferdinand quietly lay down, allowing the medics to position the support pillow for his genitalia, then using leather straps tied across his hips. To maintain stability, Maria Antonia was mildly sedated with an opium solution. Her hands were held by 2 women, taught to breathe in rhythm, and then finally, endured the penetration of something no one in the room dared name. The bed rocked, candles fell, a table overturned, and then there was silence. When the doctor emerged from the room, he said nothing. He only placed a hand on his chest, sighed, and shook his head. That night, the blood on the bedsheets was not from virginity, but from real wounds. The next morning, Maria Antonia lay motionless. She didn't eat, she didn't speak. Her eyes were open, but vacant. She didn't ask about her husband, she didn't ask about the crown. She only asked one question to an old servant. "How many times will I have to do that?" The answer was, many. Ferdinand, after clearly sensing the fear in his wife's eyes, did not retreat. On the contrary, he felt his power affirmed. Each time his wife recoiled, he felt he was still a man, even if his body was a mistake. He began to create a schedule. Every 2 weeks, the doctors would prepare the room. Maria would be sedated, and the ritual would repeat. Under the soulless eyes of ancestral portraits hanging in the room, a torture-like reproductive ritual was repeated like clockwork. After each session, Maria needed a higher dose of morphine to stop trembling. A close chaplain of hers recounted, each time she prayed, she didn't pray for a child. She prayed for herself to die in her sleep. Both times, Maria became pregnant. In 1804 and 1805, ended in miscarriage. The first time at 4 months, the second time at 8 months, she bled severely. A doctor whispered to the Queen Mother, "Her uterus cannot take another, it is too deeply damaged." But no one said that to Ferdinand. He didn't believe in physical flaws. He believed in the betrayal of women's minds. That if she miscarried, it was because she didn't want to keep the child. It was because she hated him. It was because she had allied with radical forces to undermine the royal succession. Maria, at 21, died silently within her own body. Medical records stated fever and exhaustion, but secret letters between ladies-in-waiting and nurses implied that she was addicted to high doses of opium. Comatose 4 hours each day, her body failing to recover, and her spirit utterly broken. The day she died, May 1807, it rained in Madrid. The funeral was silent. No grand music, no eulogies. Ferdinand stood by the coffin, not shedding a single tear. He only muttered a sentence that sent shivers down everyone's spine in the room, at least. "She won't abort anymore." Maria's death did not close the tragedy. It opened a pattern, a blueprint. From now on, every woman who entered the Spanish palace had to risk her life to salvage a man's self-obsession, and Ferdinand still had 3 more marriages ahead. June 1807, just weeks after Maria Antonia was interred in the royal crypt beneath El Escorial, Ferdinand VII appeared before the court, thinner, paler, but his eyes no longer weary. Instead, there was something cold and sharp as a newly honed blade, a gaze that no longer sought healing but only control. Maria's death did not break him as people expected. There was no period of pure mourning, no self-reflection, not a single apology to the Virgin Mary, something any king would do when his wife died young. On the contrary, Ferdinand reacted as if he had just escaped something that hindered him. In a closed-door meeting with his closest advisors, he said, "We need someone new, someone stronger, someone who does not consider the duty of a wife a punishment." That statement was not directed at any individual, but it marked a profound shift. Ferdinand had moved from feeling shame over his deformity to resentment towards those who did not accept it. His imperfection was no longer a private complex, but a reason to punish others. If he was a monster, then all who reacted like Maria, screaming, crying, trembling, were traitors to divine will. From then on, politics and sexuality were no longer separate categories in the Spanish court. They merged, both controlled by a man who no longer had boundaries between his body obsession and national power. And, like any dictator, Ferdinand began testing loyalty from those closest to him. His retinue, a guard who served in the royal guard, recorded in his diary, "His Majesty changed us weekly. He didn't want a familiar face. He only wanted those who hadn't yet imagined his form before being replaced." Ferdinand ordered the entire internal structure of the palace rebuilt, not for comfort, but to avoid all unsupervised gazes. Two-way mirrors were installed in corridors. Hidden listening chambers were expanded. Secret passages between the bedroom and medical room were designed so no one knew where he went, what he did, or with whom. If a servant mistakenly entered a room without being called, they disappeared. If a maid giggled in the corridor, she was interrogated, had her head shaved, and was sent back to her village. From the death of his first wife, Ferdinand had learned a lesson. His existence could only be guaranteed if he actively instilled fear first. This psychology turned him into a pathological controller, whom Freud a century later might call a person with obsessive mirroring anxiety, meaning living in fear of others, seeing his true self, and therefore wanting to control the gaze of the entire world. But the harshest gaze, Ferdinand thought, came from God. He began participating in mystical rituals every night. Not in church, but in an underground room where Jewish Kabbalists were secretly invited from Morocco. They performed sperm summoning rituals, an ancient rite rooted in Kabbalah, with the belief that the soul resides in bodily fluids, and if the soul is trapped in a deformed body, it will produce dynastic karma. In a handwritten note, Ferdinand wrote, "God made me this way, but I can make him regret it." And he did so by returning to the reproduction project. In 1808, just 1 year after Maria's death, Ferdinand asked royal doctors to conduct medical experiments. Liu Ko, the Can Thip, GGM, Kichthuk, Dijung Viet, Benang Fang, Phap Tha, Kang. No one dared refuse. A group of doctors from Austria, Germany, and Naples was summoned. They brought anatomical drawings of animal penises, diagrams of testosterone regulation from the pituitary gland, even a library of sexual botany from ancient Greece. And from this, a laboratory was opened, but not for general medical research, only to serve one individual, the king. That room was located in a special basement called Sótano de la Fertilidad, the fertility basement. There, strange devices were crafted, wooden presses lined with soft padding, reverse axis massage mechanisms, thigh muscle restraints to force blood flow backward. There were even syringes containing extracts from the brains of Arctic whales, hoping to shrink tissue. The result, failure. Not only that, scar tissue accumulated, increasing inflammatory responses, leaving Ferdinand in chronic pain and more irritable than ever. Courtiers noted, the period of 1808-1810 was the most dangerous time to work with the king. Every decision was postponed just because he was unwell. A slight pain could lead him to order the imprisonment of anyone who accidentally made noise. In 1 week, Ferdinand dismissed 4 judges, exiled to archbishops, and ordered the destruction of 50,000 printed catechisms just because he believed a passage in it implied he was impotent. The outside world began to hear the cracks from Spain. French, British, and Austrian ambassadors recorded veiled dispatches. The Spanish monarchy is dominated by a body part. No one dared write it outright, but everyone understood a monarchy was being controlled by the king's penis, and Ferdinand knew it. The more he knew, the tighter he squeezed. The policy of censorship expanded, not just about religion, but about anatomy. In a short decree, he forbade all medical students from writing dissertations related to male genital defects. He didn't want anyone to research it. Didn't want anyone to name it. He wanted to suppress any possibility of defining the truth. From here, Ferdinand entered the phase where he would begin his second marriage, no longer as a young prince, seeking hope, but as a machine dominating others' bodies to assert that his deformity was the new norm, and the next woman, Queen Isabel, would not just be a bride, she would be a reproductive prisoner, caught between a disturbed man's body and a throne crumbling day by day. When Western medicine couldn't rescue a king from his own monstrous body, people often turned to the only place that still promised miracles: superstition. For Ferdinand VII, after dozens of failed attempts at reproduction, he no longer trusted doctors, medicines, or even God. The only thing he hoped could help him overcome his deformity was the stars, amulets, ley lines, and vital energy from distant cultures. The 19th century was a time of transition. Science began to emerge, but European royalty remained deeply entrenched in a world blending Christianity with ancient esotericism. Ferdinand was no exception. He became the prime example. The more desperate he became in his sexual life, the more he revered unseen entities. The more he failed in the bedroom, the more he believed that the night of intimacy must be arranged. By the position of the planets, it all began from a letter sent to the Madrid palace in 1815. The writer, an Indian astrologer calling himself Brig Devendranov, introduced as the last descendant of the Saint Vashista, who once read The Destinies of Maria Emperors. In the letter, he claimed that the king's deformity was not a biological flaw, but a mark of Mars on the male womb, and could only be resolved by rituals combining mantras, essential oils, music, and intercourse timed with the full moon. Of the Bhadrapada cycle, Ferdinand, then desperate after the death of his second wife Isabel, immediately invited Devendrinath to Madrid in absolute secrecy. The sage arrived at the palace under the guise of ambassador of Eastern knowledge. He brought 7 sandalwood chests, inside containing incense, meteorites, snakeskin, amber, along with a chakra sutra written in ancient Sanskrit. From here, a series of strange rituals began to appear in court life. The emperor's bedroom was reformed into an Amyang nourishment chamber, according to the sage's description. The room faced south, with bronze mirrors at the 4 corners. To reflect yang vital energy, the wedding bed was lined with hot stones under the mattress to ignite vitality. Before each night of intimacy, there were 3 rituals. Vaginal meditation. The queen was asked to sit in a yoga posture, rub eucalyptus oil on her navel and forehead, listening to the sound of Tibetan bowls rung 3 times, linked breathing. Ferdinand and his wife had to lie facing each other, breathe in Samaveda rhythm, using bamboo tubes to lead breath to synchronize energy flows. Birth mantra chanting. Devendranath chanted Om Gab, Vriddhi Swaha in Sanskrit, accompanied by a drum and ivory chimes struck to the rhythm of fluctuating heartbeats. All these things were performed before any physical contact began. When the ritual was done, the doctor would enter. Custom-made pillows, straps, and anesthetics were used as before. But this time, Ferdinand believed that the reproductive soul had been summoned. Children of the stars would be born from this night. The problem was, his wife didn't believe. Queen Isabel was not a Hindu, nor was she someone who could forget her wedding night where she lost blood, lost her sanity, and lost all sense of control over her body. To her, these rituals were nothing more than cruelty disguised as divinity. In secret letters to her confessor, she described them as a horror theater. I am a forced actress. Mantras are the soundtrack. The king is a mad director who cannot distinguish between reality and delusion. But Ferdinand didn't care. The more his wife resisted, the tighter he held on. No longer just astrology. Now it was Western horoscopes, Eastern charms, Arabian essential oils, Chinese cinnabar, and the burning of magic books from Morocco. He had a private library built, named Sala de Concepcion, Astral, the Astral Conception Room, where hundreds of manuscripts from ancient Egypt to medieval France were housed, all writing about the ideal time to create a prince. Ferdinand even instructed the Queen to eat according to an astrological diet. Every Monday eat almonds to soften the uterus. Every Thursday drink orange blossom water to call forth the vitality of Jupiter. Avoid eggs during Mercury retrograde periods and only use mint on crescent moon days. A maid was whipped for accidentally serving toast on a Wednesday, the day of fiery fate bringing misfortune. When failures continued as a rule, Ferdinand grew more insane. He summoned Jewish Kabbalists from Saft Sufi mystics from the Ottoman Empire and an Egyptian female forensic expert who spoke ancient Greek, who claimed to be able to decode voices from unfertilized eggs. And it was during this period that the queens began to exhibit strange symptoms: postcoital psychic reactions, religious hallucinations, fear of shadows, temporary aphasia, and unprovoked seizures. Doctors called it holy hysteria, a form of ancient PTSD mixed with archaic superstition. Rare but recorded in the history of forced royal marriages. Ferdinand didn't care. Each time his wife fainted, he said, "The soul is resisting to move to the next form." Each time his wife said nothing, he said, "She is possessed by ancestral karma." And if his wife resisted, he increased the dose of the ritual. That night, they had to pray to the deities until dawn. Outside the palace, the Spanish people lived in poverty. Rebellions in the American colonies spread. French armies hovered at the border. But at the center of Spanish power, the king was only concerned with choosing the right time for conception to produce a child born under Uranus. And then, one time, it seemed fate gave in. Queen Isabel became pregnant. Ferdinand was overjoyed. The Thanksgiving ceremony lasted 6 nights, with 108 Indian-style candles, frankincense smoke, prayers in Hebrew, Sanskrit, and Latin. He declared, "The precious soul has entered the womb. A new dynasty will begin." But 7 months later, Queen Isabel suffered convulsions, hemorrhage, premature birth. The baby died after 4 hours, and Ferdinand didn't cry. He only whispered, "I must have chosen the wrong time." Madrid, winter, 1832. The sky was ash-gray, wind cutting through the thick wooden windows of the Palacio Real. In a third-floor room, the emperor's bedroom, a man lay on a large cedar bed, his body emaciated, eyes deep-set, and gaze seemingly piercing through walls. Ferdinand VII, now no longer an image of power, but a living wax figure, melting away day by day from physical ailments and mental decay. He no longer left his room. Physicians reported the king suffered from chronic digestive disorders, essential tremor, neurological degeneration, and had signs of progressive psychosis. But those were just medical diagnoses. Those living close to him spoke plainly. His Majesty is being devoured by his own ghosts. Ferdinand didn't sleep. Every night he stayed awake, pacing like a phantom through the interconnected rooms. Via secret passages he had built himself, he checked every door, eavesdropped behind walls, read servants' private letters, then quietly returned to bed, to continue staring at the ceiling. On the walls hung oil paintings. His 3 dead wives, Maria Antonia, Isabel, Josepha, looked down at him with eyes unclear whether of reproach or forgiveness. Beneath each painting, he placed a plaster death mask, and every morning he sat for hours talking to them. Courtiers had to pretend not to hear. And on the wooden table at the foot of his bed were dozens of secret files, paternity test reports for Princess Isabella. Each document was Ferdinand's desperate attempt to verify that he was indeed the biological father. Though deep down he knew he wasn't. A German doctor once invited to analyze the curvature of the nasal bone between father and daughter was expelled from Madrid the very next day for reasons unknown. Rumors suggested he had written too directly. There is no evidence to support direct bloodline. Ferdinand never accepted that, but he also couldn't erase it. And like every secret that can neither be denied nor spoken. It became a corrosive venom within. He began looking at Isabella with eyes both tender and hateful. On days when the princess laughed brightly in the garden, he would whisper to his guard, "That child is laughing at me." When the princess drew a picture of a burning house, he asked, "Is she drawing the overthrow of the court?" Ferdinand turned his paternal affection into a twisted defense mechanism, where the child was no longer a daughter, but a living object, proving his permanent biological failure. At the same time, Spain was falling apart. The wars for independence in Latin America had torn apart the colonies. Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Peru. Once the jewels in the Spanish crown had now left the throne, Ferdinand had no clear policy response. Each time a territory was lost, he only wrote in his diary, "God punishes me," but then followed, "Or we lose what is not ours to keep what pretends to be ours." No one understood that sentence. Perhaps he was talking about Isabella. Ministers could not meet fully, as the king constantly cancelled appointments to inspect food for poisoning. All dishes had to pass 3 rounds of tasting, waiting 30 minutes to ensure no slow poisons. A servant once fainted from fear. He was accused of faking illness to distract. Interrogated for 12 hours, Queen Maria Cristina lived in a kaleidoscope of surveillance. She was not allowed to write letters without 2 witnesses, not allowed to light candles for too long, because Ferdinand believed fire could signal foreigners. She was not allowed to hug Isabella for more than 3 minutes in front of him. Every intimacy, from a lullaby to a kiss on the forehead, was analyzed as a plot of mental manipulation in her secret diary, found later in a wall cavity in her chambers. Maria Cristina wrote, "I don't live, I perform. In every action, I calculate. Does my gaze reveal anything? Am I tilting my head at his preferred angle? If I blink after a question, will he think I'm signaling?" The palace was no longer a seat of power, but a collective nervous tightrope walk. Grandees learned to communicate in neutral, non-corporeal language. The situation is relatively stable. The loyalty of the populace may grow in terms of future belief. Every sentence avoided pronouns, avoided affirmations, avoided specifics. Just accidentally saying, "Your Majesty's daughter is very clever," instead of "the princess exhibits appropriate behavior," could cost one their position for implying illegitimate succession. Ferdinand built an additional secret passage between his room and Isabella's, with an intermittent window where he could observe his daughter without being detected. He watched every day, every cry, every frown, not out of love, but to control. That child, he believed, was the key to keeping the throne from collapsing, and also the reason he could not die in peace. But the body did not wait for him to finish arranging things. Entering 1833, Ferdinand began to decline rapidly. His hand tremors became severe. His stomach could not absorb food. His breathing was sporadic. Sometimes, he spoke in a child's voice, calling the names of his dead queens. Sometimes, he ordered the execution of generals who had died 10 years prior. The chief physician recorded in his log, "His Majesty shows signs of losing differentiation of time, persons, and self, yet still grasps power as tightly as if there had been no turmoil." Death did not come like a violent illness, but like a lamp slowly extinguished by thinning air. He did not resist. He only looked at the ceiling and whispered, "Isabella, don't let them take you." On September 29, 1833, Ferdinand VII died, not from illness, but from the utter depletion of energy from a life he had tried to preserve through an unresolvable obsession. On September 30, 1833, the sky over Madrid was neither raining nor sunny. A silvery grey light covered the palace, as if time paused just to wait for the body to be taken away. Ferdinand VII was dead. When he drew his last breath, there were only 3 people in the room: Queen Maria Cristina, an elderly, almost deaf priest, and the private physician who held a lead-sealed box with him like an unavoidable sentence. There was no grand mourning, no state funeral, because in his final months, Ferdinand had abolished all traditional rituals. He wanted to personally design his death as a private ceremony, where no one was allowed to touch his sacred legacy. And that legacy was not the throne. It was his body, more precisely, his genitalia. The royal physician, following the king's dying wish, performed a special autopsy, not to find the cause of death, for everyone knew Ferdinand died from nervous exhaustion and organ failure after decades of reproductive obsession. This autopsy was to confirm what all of Spain had whispered for 2 decades. What was the biological structure, legendary of the king, really? And then they unfolded the cloth. The physician, in the confidential autopsy report, recorded in trembling handwriting, the penile structure measured 35.7 centimeters, with an uneven circumference, the base only 3.4 centimeters, but the tip swelling up to 12.8 centimeters. The shape resembled a twisted serpent with fibrous tissue knots underneath. Internally, there were traces of scar tissue, torn in segments, possibly due to self-mutilation or unskilled external intervention. The soft tissue at the apex had abnormal verrucous growths of unknown nature. And then, he wrote further, we found traces of approximately 17 old stitches dating back to his adolescence. It is clear the king had performed his own surgeries to alter the physical form of his genitalia. This caused not only permanent biological damage, but also created chronic pain reflexes, leading to prolonged paranoid behaviors. It was in those stitches that modern historians found one of the most frightening medical evidences. Ferdinand VII was one of the very few emperors who self-mutilated his own body to fit a norm he could not achieve. He was not born a monster. He was turned into a monster by the torment of a world that did not permit deviation. After the examination, the king's genitalia was preserved separately. The physician special embalmed it with formaldehyde, wrapped it in silk, placed it in a glass tube, then lead-sealed it with the papal seal. The entire artifact was sent in a closed carriage to the Vatican, bypassing all borders, sealed like a sacred relic. But no one was allowed to display it, and from then on, it vanished from official history. But those who saw it all recounted a similar feeling. It was not a biological organ. It was a symbol of the deepest failure in royal history. The failure when a dynasty used reproductive function as a measure of legitimacy. What about the child? Isabella II, the child born from a lie, growing up under the suspicious gaze of a father, unsure if he was truly her father, finally wore the crown. At just 3 years old, she was declared the legitimate heir. But the throne she sat upon was not a throne of power. It was a throne of unresolved tragedy. From the day she was crowned, Isabella lived between 2 public opinions. Some called her the Princess of Destiny. Others mocked her as someone else's child on the king's seat. Her entire life, she never escaped Ferdinand's shadow, not as a father, but as the only man in history to leave a dynasty by means of a preserved sexual organ. Spain, in the century that followed, never fully recovered. The empire that once controlled half the globe from Mexico to the Philippines was eroded by war, division, and a truth no one wanted to speak. It all began with a man who could not procreate. Ferdinand VII was not overthrown by sword, not assassinated, not dethroned. He died while holding full power, but that power only served an irresolvable personal pain. When we look back at his entire reign, we don't see groundbreaking policies, no great victories, no memorable reforms. All he left behind were 3 queens who died from physical trauma, hundreds of doctors' diaries describing sexual obsessions, a file cabinet of the princess's DNA, and a set of genitalia sealed like a cursed artifact. That was not a personal tragedy. That was an eternal warning. A dynasty can collapse not because of war, but because a king's personal fear becomes national policy. A country can be controlled, not by ideals, but by hatred stemming from a mirror and a bedroom. And sometimes, the destiny of an entire nation lies in one single thing, whether a man can or cannot perform sexually in the right way.